afternoon. It's Friday, the 8th of September 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today from north of the border is David Scott. Welcome to the programme, David. Okay, well, we'll get straight on with Sub-Saharan Africa and Nigeria in particular, because the Russian Foreign Ministry is warning that Boko Haram extremists, terrorists, have become more active in northeastern Nigeria, northwestern Cameroon. Just put that on screen so that you can see where that is. Just to the northeast of Nigeria is the main problem. Maria Zakharova said, "We're concerned over the growing security threats and the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Nigeria and Cameroon. We support the efforts of Nigeria, Cameroon and sub-regional organisations to eradicate the terrorist threat." Now, it's hardly a surprise that this is happening, because just last week, of course, we reported that Boris Johnson and Priti Patel had been visiting Nigeria, where they promised £200 million in aid to help the fight against Boko Haram. They also pledged assistance to prevent human trafficking. It was their first joint visit to Nigeria, and they visited the northeast state of Borno, which is exactly where Zakharova is highlighting increased Boko Haram activity. Boko Haram has killed more than 20,000 people so far in this, displaced 1.7 million, left 8.5 million in need of urgent help. And they say that they're trying to create an Islamic State in the Lake Chad region. And so, as we said on Wednesday last week, Patel announced this aid package of £200 million to prevent 1.5 million people lapsing into famine and help keep 100,000 boys and girls in education. Well, that's what they say. That's what she said. Is that what the money's being used for? Well, you've got to remember that when I asked the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for the financial statements regarding money sent to the White Helmets, for example, they refused to give it. So the question is, what have they got to hide? What is Department for International Development money globally actually being spent on? And David, is it a coincidence that everywhere DFID money goes, activity in Britain's three key historic trades increases, and those being terrorism, human slavery and drugs? Any thoughts on that?
The population. So I don't know, maybe Boris Johnson's the mule, or maybe what we've got is a very large budget not being used for the claimed end result, but in fact, well, when you see it being directed to people like the White Helmets, who are terrorists, it is very concerning what we're doing on the geopolitical stage. Because one thing is for certain, it's not being revealed to the public. It's not being discussed in Parliament. There's no honesty. There's no clarity.
Indeed. Now, the other area which seems to be falling apart at the moment, of course, is Myanmar. Well, this perhaps gives us a clue what's actually going on. An article here from Sputnik. The headline is "Soros and Hydrocarbons, What's Really Behind the Rohingya Crisis in Myanmar." And they say that the Rohingya conflict, which erupted between Buddhists and Muslims in Myanmar's western state in late August, was apparently fanned by external global players, and that's according to the director of the Centre for Southeast Asia, Australia and Oceania at the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He said that this is a game against China, first of all, that China has very large investments in the area. And he said, second, it's aimed at fueling Muslim extremism in Southeast Asia. And third, it's the attempt to sow discord within ASEAN. That's the ASEAN countries between Myanmar and Muslim-dominated Indonesia and Malaysia. And they're highlighting the fact that George Soros had joined a US task force group aimed at increasing US cooperation with other countries to bring about a long overdue political, economic and social transformation in Burma. Well, the question in my mind, David, is Aung San Suu Kyi now discovering the duplicity of the British, in a sense, because she has, of course, been supported by the British to get herself in a particular position in Burma as head of state. And now, of course, she's suffering the consequences because, it's not just Soros that's at work here. Britain has had a long history of messing about in that part of the world, and particularly in Burma. So Desmond Tutu here now is saying that her silence is too high a price. Maybe she's finding herself in a bit of a difficult position.
Well, perhaps. Or what we're finding out is she wasn't quite as advertised. Britain's record in Burma, it was perhaps one of the more problematic areas of the empire. But under British control, there was more rule of law, there was more peace than we're seeing now. Burma's a very difficult area in terms of terrain. It's very difficult to move along the coast up towards the north, where the trouble is, because all of the rivers and gorges and valleys run the other way towards the sea. It's high rainfall, very dense jungle for very, very large parts of it still. It's an area where it is difficult to maintain control unless you have the support of the local population. And it's also riven with more than one set of ethnic and religious divisions. Now, that makes it a very difficult area to maintain peace and maintain any sort of tranquility. Now, if you're looking for human thriving and you're interested in having that apply to the whole of the population, that means it's hard to do. The question here is the current Burmese government, which was heralded as being as liberating the country from communism and tyranny and introducing freedom and democracy and Western liberal values. Well, is that actually true? Is it true perhaps only in part? Are we seeing them taking a view that they don't want this ethnic minority and religious minority as part of their country, and doing a little bit of ethnic cleansing and philosophical, religious and ideological cleansing, something that seems to be becoming ever more popular the world, across the whole of the world, from Israel to, well, not Europe, but all across the Far East too.
Well, that may well be the case, but in this case, as is being highlighted in the Sputnik article, there's quite a lot of external intervention here, not just Soros. Council on Foreign Relations, interested in promoting Change Burma, Time for Change, was the sort of main policy document that they pushed out on this, saying that democracy cannot survive in Burma without the help of the United States and the international community. There are so many international players in this. I just wonder, is it a bit more than ethnic cleansing in the sense you're talking about?
I've no doubt that it is. I mean, change. There's the one of the international words. Change you can believe in. We want change because, hey, things aren't perfect, so let's have change. So you're seeing the Soros type agenda being sold to the local population. So yes, absolutely, there will be international manipulation, and the things that are being manipulated are the divisions already present within the country. And it would appear that the international players are now getting very expert at exploiting these divisions and promoting conflict. And the conflict and the death will be used to make the change that they believe is desirable. The problem is for the ordinary people on the ground who bleed and who die and who suffer, the change will in fact be a change for the worse.
Okay, well, let's move on to NATO then. And, we'll start off with Boris Johnson, actually. And I think I probably have to give a health warning here because you may need some kind of bucket nearby when you see this image. This is the Telegraph. And the headline is Boris Johnson enjoys a tank ride during a visit to Estonia. Well, he's in Estonia because, of course, Britain is leading the forward reaction force there. And he's also there to take part in an informal meeting of EU foreign ministers, which is all a bit strange. He's going to see the best of British technology and so on. It is one of these jollies that he seems to be enjoying at the moment, and no better place to have a PR exercise. And I just was amused by this photograph of Boris Johnson sitting on top of a tank with his thumb up and padded up with his body armour and so on. Because, of course, if we remember back, I don't know, 20, 30 years, something, I'm not really sure, to Margaret Thatcher, she also took great pleasure in sitting on top of a tank. And so this trip for Boris, more than any kind of international diplomacy, seems to be more about creating a PR spin for him, promote him as the great leader, and invoke memories of Margaret Thatcher. You couldn't make it up, David.
I find it difficult to take the concept of Boris Johnson as a great leader seriously. You know the one where he was hanging from the crane, the photograph of him hanging from the crane, looking pained and waving lots of little Union flags. I thought that was, in terms of getting the very top job, that photograph was perhaps the end. I don't think he's got enough credibility.
Yes, I think you're right. Right, let's move on to...
However many tanks he sits on.
Yes. Let's move on to NATO. This is a bit more serious. NATO's first Assistant Secretary General, Arent, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, actually, von Loringhoven. He is the Secretary General for Intelligence and Security, and he's published an article basically demanding, or he's presenting the direction that NATO is going in with regard to NATO's intelligence services. He says that earlier this year, NATO stood up its new Joint Intelligence and Security Division. This is the most significant reform in the history of the Allied intelligence in response to the challenging threat environment posed by an assertive Russia and the rise of terrorism and instability in the south. The Allies are fundamentally adapting how NATO organizes and analyzes intelligence. He said that the lines between civilian and military, between war and peace, are increasingly blurred. Now, this is a theme which has been developing within NATO since the 2015 European Defence Agency conference, which NATO took part in. And it's something that we've highlighted on a number of occasions on this programme, and something that I think that is cause for concern, because blurring the lines between civilian and military and between war and peace, this is real 1984 style language. He goes on to say this also makes it necessary to better integrate civilian and military intelligence at NATO into a single efficient structure which can provide a coherent intelligence picture to the North Atlantic Council and NATO's military committee. And he ends up by saying, one NATO, this is the new brand, one NATO will be our guiding principle. As we set out this path, I hope we can maintain the enthusiasm and positive dynamic that have so greatly helped us in setting up the new division. So they've set up this new division. It's all about merging civilian and military facilities. Am I overreacting to this?
No, I don't think you are. I think there's a lot of very concerning bits and pieces in there. Where's national sovereignty in that? Where's the decision making? If we're one NATO, can we say no? Because we're all one. Yes? One's a very interesting word. In anything that's left wing or totalitarian or anti the individual, shall we say, collectivist, it always uses one. You know, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. We see it in Scottish nationalism circles, using the one nation, one way forward, one direction. They actually used One Direction.
Did they?
It wasn't the greatest. It wasn't the greatest slogan in the world. But this keeps coming up. Words like forward, words like one, are a signal for the underlying principles that are driving it here, which is towards a unified, centrally controlled, authoritarian state that goes across national borders and eliminates individual liberty wherever that conflicts with the state, the super-state's agenda.
Just coming on to the more general point of the separation of powers between military and civilian institutions and this drive from the European Union and NATO. And in this, we have to say that NATO and the EU are absolutely aligned. This is the same kind of rhetoric coming out of both institutions. So merging between civilian and military, and the merging between war and peace. If we have a merger between war and peace, does that mean we're at perpetual war? Does it mean we're at perpetual peace? If you can't tell the difference between war and peace, what kind of world are we going to be living in?
Well, it is 1984 as an instruction manual, not a warning, is the sort of world we're living in. We're seeing militarized police. We're seeing more weapons in the hands of police. We're seeing militarized uniforms. We're seeing armored vehicles in the hands of police across Europe. And yes, what sort of world is that heading towards? I mean, at what point did NATO cease to be actually relevant in its original form? When the Warsaw Pact was dismantled,
Yeah.
there was no need for NATO from that point on, and it's been morphed from a defensive organisation, which it more or less was, under a genuine external threat, into an instrument of global power. But I don't remember anyone actually consulting the people, actually consulting the British people, whether we want to be in that.
Absolutely. Okay, well, look, let's move on. A number of weeks ago, we mentioned this incident, 7 Navy crew missing, skipper hurt after collision off Japan, and this was the US naval ship which collided with a container ship, is that right?
Yes, that's the USS Fitzgerald was the first one, yes. So it had an accident with a container ship, 7 dead, and as you see, extremely extensive damage, not very far away from losing the ship, I think.
And that was quickly followed up by the USS John McCain.
Yes, and this is an almost action replay. Here we see an enormous hole in the side of the ship. I think it was an oil tanker this time. And this is in fact one of 4 serious accidents involving United States vessels in the Far East Fleet this year alone. So there's clearly something of systemic concern. And this next article here is from an admiral. Now this is a very interesting piece. This is written by James A. Lyons, a retired US Navy admiral who commanded the US Pacific Fleet and was a senior US military representative to the United Nations. So he's extremely well qualified. And he comments here about the loss of 2 sophisticated key anti-ballistic missile-capable destroyers within a matter of several weeks. And he then highlights that one area we've not heard is the third rail for the Navy as it deals with the personnel manning policies for the ships and aircraft squadrons. What impact has diversity policies had on ships manning criteria? Implicit within this is examining the impact of President Obama's social engineering mandates, for example, Executive Order 13583. Now, this here is a requirement here to establish, as you see, coordinated government-wide initiative to promote diversity and inclusion in the federal workforce. It starts off quite amazingly with the following. Our nation derives strength from the diversity of its population and from its commitment to equal opportunities for all. Well, in terms of the Navy, you derive strength from having experienced personnel who are competent and know what their business is. And this order goes on to require a coordinated government-wide initiative to promote diversity and inclusion in the federal workforce, and it instructs all agencies to comply with this. And the tone is urgent. The tone is do something now, change your policies, change your hiring policies. So rather than have well-qualified people who are not, who don't comply with this completely arbitrary ethnic and sexual and everything else and diversity agenda that came from the Obama White House, there's some other criteria being involved in selecting personnel. And now the United States Navy are losing ships or having them seriously damaged. So that admiral's very concerned. Other issues raised with this is, well, for example, the size of the Navy. This is an article here from the Asia Times, and they comment that the United States Navy has shrunk from nearly 600 ships to 275 over the last 30 years, while its worldwide missions have increased. So you see the stretch, even with the resources of the United States, you see they're becoming increasingly stretched. Even though they're running the whole Navy via deficit spending, money they don't really have, they're still struggling to cope. They don't have enough ships to cover the area they're covering. And then when we go on to the PC area, Just to reiterate what the Admiral was saying, is that this is typified by the Navy Secretary Ray Mabus, who was more interested in foisting the Obama administration's progressive social experiments on the Navy than ensuring the force had its ship's personnel and the money needed to accomplish its mission, which is, after all, fighting wars. Mabus's efforts to introduce expensive green fuels, repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, expunging the word man from naval ratings and naming ships after social activists had nothing to do with the Navy. It was misplaced and distracting. He'd have done better to ensure the Navy was spending enough time on training for basics in navigation, ship handling and collision avoidance, emergency drills, bridge operations, and not surrendering well-armed United States ships to the Iranian coastal defence craft. So that's pretty damning in the state of the United States Navy and the state of the political leadership. We've talked a lot about our own political leadership and what it's done to our armed forces, but that applies absolutely in the United States as well.
And then just to end this section, the star here, many US ships in the Pacific lack certification. What certification are they talking about?
Yes, this is a certification regarding, excuse me, to get the right bit. It's essentially a certification that the ships are fit for sea and ready for action. And everything is up to date, and they are ready to go. Now, the change in this has been quite dramatic. It's gone up from a few percent of the ships failing to meet this criteria to 37% of the entire US Pacific fleet have the certification of essentially seaworthiness and readiness for sea and readiness for service are out of date. And this shows a training backlog, and it shows that they're struggling to cope.
So the US experiencing the same type of problems as us. Is this perhaps what we're saying here is the one NATO approach? We're going to see emerge a unification of many nations' military into one military. Is this the same exercises going on within the United States, do you think, as has been going on in Europe, to try to avoid overlap between various nations as they develop unified military structures?
Well, the United States is 75% of NATO, so it's a little bit different. But what it's doing is no longer being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What we are now being is world police, a replacement for the British Empire, a world leading maritime empire, and they don't have the resources for that. So I think we are going to see increasing pressure brought on Britain, brought on the whole of Western Europe, which is a peninsula sticking out into the sea after all.
Yeah.
To pick up more of the slack, to take more of the load, because America is going to be increasingly stretched, and when it looks to do things like impose its will in the South China Sea, well, its ability to do that is going to be seriously questioned.
Well, it's interesting you say that. But just to finish this, of course, Trump did make exactly that comment at the inauguration of the new NATO headquarters in Brussels a month or two ago, where he basically, threatened the other NATO countries, particularly European countries, to start taking up the slack, the fact that they haven't been contributing enough to NATO's budget over the last few years. So I think you're bang on with that. Okay, let's move on to financial matters then. Reuters here reporting that European Central Bank policymakers have agreed on a stimulus cut. And what they're saying is that they are going to reduce the level of quantitative easing to a mere 40 billion euros a month, or possibly 20 billion euros a month with extension options, including 6 months or 9 months. So those are the two options they have. It's still a staggering amount of money. Any decision, Reuters said, should also be backed by broad consensus, suggesting that policymakers are keen to avoid a repeat of the public discord that followed past rulings when opponents at national central banks and even the European Central Bank's Executive Board publicly criticised decisions. So it looks like they're wanting to wind that back. just before we move on to corporate debt, have you any thoughts on that? Because this situation continues to be just get increasingly insane.
Yes, insane. It's a faith-based economic system, because what we're meant to do is we're meant to trust these people because they've got PhDs. You know, it's a PhD standard. That's what we're on. We're not on gold standard. We're on PhD standard. And the great wisdom of people such as Draghi and such as Janet Yellen will see us through, because they can survey the whole of the world economic scene, and they can make just the right decisions and affect the levers in just the right amount to fine-tune the economy, and everything will be fine. It's complete nonsense. It's a fabrication. They don't know what they're doing. None of the levers are really connected to anything. And many of their actions, such as they can act now, because the changes they're making are very, very small. We've been threatened with interest rate hikes from the Americans, always 6 months in the future. For the last 5 years now, we will be raising interest rates, really. But they never do, because they can't. And they'll talk about reducing the amount of QE. But the money's got to be pumped in somewhere. It's got to come in Europe, it's got to come in Japan, it's got to come in China, who had a huge amount of debt increase just the last quarter. Or it's got to come in America. And because it can move around, they can take turns and all the rest of it. But they have to take turns to try and stabilise the exchange rates. And it's a big game. And it doesn't help the underlying economy, because the underlying economy depends on other things. It depends on the capital structure. It depends on real hard physical things, buildings and plant and machinery and expertise and training. And if expenditure's put in the wrong places because of the wrong signals from idiots in the central banks, then that malinvestment is what ultimately causes the economy to fail. So the longer this goes on, the bigger the crash that will eventually try to correct the imbalances. But as the economy tries to correct itself, all the central bankers will be pushing it in the other way. That's what happened in 2008-9, and that's what's going to happen again. It's really there is no sign of any realism coming in the world financial system or in the central bankers, and the best thing we could do is not have them, but we are stuck with them, and they will do a great deal of damage.
I think I agree with everything you've said there. Now, of course, the question for many investors is, where do they put their money in a negative interest rate world? And of course, what ends up happening is bubbles get blown, and the US corporate debt, I mean, Britain's no better position, it has to be said, but the US corporate debt situation, powering ahead, according to the Financial Times. I think the skin of the bubble is getting thinner every second. But what really struck me about this article, David, was they say a host of companies, including Apple, IBM, Home Depot, and Visa, are tapping investors for funding. And to be honest, I did wonder why the likes of Apple would be issuing corporate bonds in this way, because they are, what is Apple now? The largest company on the planet. They do not need extra cash at this point. So is there some other agenda at work here, is what's going through my mind at the moment? I don't get...
Well, some of it's going to be stock buyback, because the borrowing costs are now so low that they'll be lower than the dividend to the shareholders for many companies. So you borrow and you buy the shares back, and you have less cash going out, which is a very strange and perverse incentive. But
isn't it? Yes, indeed. Just another article to describe or to explain the insanity of this. This is from Forbes. 3 quants, this is quantitative traders in their 20s, running a hedge fund, making $1 billion of trades daily. Now, unlike the average quantitative hedge fund, they're not leaving any positions open overnight. They close out all their positions at the end of the day. But they are on average doing $1 billion worth of trades every single day. And the question is, David, what could possibly go wrong?
Yes, what could go wrong with that? Yeah, it's another one of these things which are simply generating instability. and generating perverse incentives. But in a zero interest rate policy, which makes no sense, right? Negative interest rates make no logical sense at all. It's saying, I'll give you a pound, £100 now or £100 in a year, which would you prefer? And you say, well, I'd rather have it in a year's time. It makes no sense. And in that nonsensical world, very strange things start to happen. All the incentives are against building up the real economy and are in favour of, these sort of paper money games.
Yeah.
And this is not doing anything to improve the lot of the ordinary man in the street who depends on the real economy, not these bubbles. But it does build up, in one way it does affect the ordinary man in the street, it builds up bubbles that affects him or her. So the education bubble, the housing market bubble, these are propelled by this sort of madness. And those are the bubbles that when they pop, leave people in sometimes desperate situations.
Of course, one of the potential solutions for the lot of the man in the street is universal basic income. And of course, this is being presented as a solution to the problem of the fourth industrial revolution, that AI and robotics is going to replace all our jobs, and therefore we need a universal basic income. But perhaps something of what we just said gives another clue as to why they're really pushing this forward. But this Nicola Sturgeon announcing the funding for a trial of universal basic income, formerly a fringe idea favoured by left-wing economists at liberal institutions in America. This article says the idea of a basic income has gained traction in recent years as fears grow over depressed wage growth and the rise of automation. What's she up to?
Oh, she's just buying into more stupidity. We have an article on the UK column called Masquerade, Paper Pound Notes on Parade, which I did a few months ago. And that looks at the origin of this idea. Now, the origin goes back to the 1960s because someone said, well, look, there's this new technology called computers. And computers are going to automate all of this office work, and there'll be nothing to do. By the time you get to 1980, there'll be nothing to do. There'll be no jobs for people because the economy will be so efficient. What we have to do is just pay people to live so that they can go off and do their own thing. And it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. It'll be utopia. Now, this didn't happen. And it's completely incoherent. As all these money printing, free money, the government will be your father, mother, and everything else schemes are. But they keep coming back because people don't have the basic economic understanding. Certainly, Nicola Sturgeon doesn't have the basic economic understanding to spot a con job when one comes past. So yeah, they're going to look at this. The Green Party out in Scotland have already advocated this, but it's £100 a week or something. So it's hardly a full income. What they're doing is they're looking at the welfare state, which is shambolic, on its knees, very expensive to run, and they're trying to take out old age pensions and all child benefits and all other benefits and not means test any of it, and then just take that cash and a bit more, put tax
Okay, well, welcome back. I do apologise for the technical break there. David, I believe you were just at the point of describing Nicola Sturgeon as economically illiterate, but let's just quickly finish off that point about UBI, because I suppose the main point about it is that if people are reliant on government for their income, for all of their income, that's a pretty potentially draconian situation.
Yes, it promotes state control. The basic concept is that you pay people enough that they can live on it without working, but they'll still work. And not only will they still work, they'll still do all the dirty, horrible, unpleasant jobs out of some sort of sense of duty, I guess. It doesn't work. So what happens in practice is the level of income distribution is set much lower than you can actually survive on to maintain some incentive. But a larger proportion of your income comes from the government. So the government has larger and larger control over your life.
Yes, indeed. Right, look, we're pretty much out of time, David, so I'm just going to run forward to this article because both you and I wanted to comment on it. It's got to be the most disgusting article that the Daily Telegraph has ever published. The headline is Ted Heath accusers in line for compensation after police appeal for victims, and victims is in inverted commas. They say dozens of people encouraged by police to accuse Sir Edward Heath of child sex abuse stand to earn tens of thousands of pounds in taxpayer-funded compensation. The complainants, who came forward after a senior detective made a public appeal outside Heath's home, are understood to be entitled to the compensation, even though the former Prime Minister is dead and cannot defend his reputation. The alleged victims are in line for government-approved awards despite the fact police are accused of drumming up a witch hunt against Heath. The Telegraph has disclosed how huge sums have been paid by the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority to fantasists who made up false sex abuse claims, and that the money has not been clawed back, prompting ministers to begin an investigation into the scheme. And so it goes on. Now, this is the Torygraph, David, but the way that this article has been written, to say that it is devoid of any balance is far from the truth. It's despicable.
It's pure propaganda, right? And I think it's very interesting as an exercise in pure propaganda. So the first thing you notice, Ted Heath accusers in line for compensation. So they're queuing up, right? This is a handout. This is begging. After police appeal for victims. Victims are in inverted commas because there are no victims. And then the next thing is a photograph. Look how they've selected the photograph. There's Ted Heath sitting there looking tired and pained. And he's an old man. Oh, look what they're doing to me. I serve my country and look what they're doing to my reputation. Poor me. That's what it says. That's what that photograph says. And they then go on to then rubbish the whole idea that there was a series of victims of Ted Heath and of high-profile paedophiles within Parliament, despite the fact that we've got more evidence than we know what to do with, including lots of witness statements, victim statements. Many of these things where the people are dead, it's accepted that they were child abusers, and not in the case of Ted Heath because it's former Prime Minister and there's a more political incentive not to accept it. Now, the next thing we notice, who wrote it? Who wrote this rubbish? Well, that's quite interesting because it's by Robert Mendick, chief reporter, and Martin Evans, crime reporter, and James Cragg. So the whole of the Telegraph has got their necks on the line here. But that also says to me that's a corporate decision, and no one reporter would actually stand up and pen that. They actually wanted safety in numbers. Now, we know that the report on the investigation into Ted Heath is coming out soon. We know that they've had large numbers of victims come forward. And if you're not going to appeal to victims to come forward and say that we are investigating this, we will listen to you, come and tell us what happened, I don't know how you get victims. We're going to be reaching out to victims in Scotland via the Fresh Start Foundation. The first stage is going to be just that. Come and talk to us. Tell us your story. Tell us what happened to you. Because how else do you start appealing to victims of this sort of abuse? I think this is a preemptive strike against that investigation, against Wiltshire Police, who are conducting the investigation.
And against Mike Veal himself.
And against Mike Veal. Because they know what's coming, and what's coming is going to be absolutely devastating, I suspect. So we'll see, but I think as an example of how to spin a story, how to lie to the public, how to try and manipulate emotions, how to do everything that's dirty in journalism, the Telegraph has penned something there that will stand as an exemplar of all of those things for decades to come.
And the mainstream media wonders why it's in trouble. And today, I don't know whether you noticed, David, but I think the Mirror Group is now looking to buy the company that owns the Daily Express. So we're seeing further consolidation within the mainstream media in this country, because I guess they aren't doing very well. And the question, is this any surprise?
No, they're going to lose increasingly their audience, and it's going to be taken by the alternative media and people like us and YouTube videos and people who are prepared to tell the truth. And do so with a bit of honesty and a bit of candour and perhaps a wry smile, and not this sort of thing. Now, we know there's a lot. We covered a lot of stories that come out through the mainstream media. It's extremely important. A free press is vital to have any sort of control or restraint on what the politicians get up to, and the role of the press is absolutely essential. But when you see newspapers with the standing of the Telegraph behave in that way, they simply don't deserve that position anymore. They've behaved in such a craven manner, abandoning, let's remember, children who have been raped by the most powerful man in the country. They deserve to die. It deserves to be closed.
And I think that is a perfect point to leave it for today. David, thank you very, very much for joining me today. I think Brian will be back on Monday. I believe that's the case. So we will see you as usual at 1 p.m. on Monday lunchtime. Have a good weekend in the meantime, and thanks for joining us. Thanks again, David. Bye-bye.